The last caller referencing some of the regulations that you face in agriculture. There is a writer today at Washington Times on the op-ed pages. Here's the headline: Activists seek animal personhood in courts. I always am reminded when I see those headlines or those types of columns or stories about the Far Side cartoon where you see a crocodile sitting in a witness stand in a courtroom, and the crocodile's looking back at a prosecutor and says, "Of course I did it in cold blood. I'm a reptile." But the argument being made by the animal rights activists at this point is, well, look, if corporations can be legally classified as people, why not horses, cows, and pigs? So, yes, they're going to try to make things even worse for you down on the farm. And it it's madness. At least corporations are made up of people working toward a common goal. I don't know about, a pig, which is walking around and thinking, eat, sleep, poop, eat, sleep, poop, eat, sleep, poop, if it's thinking at all. 924, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310. KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com. Our friend Dr. Eric F. Jones. I wanted to point out he is still looking for new patients, and he has weekend appointments, that would be Saturdays, as well as evening appointments available. He has a holistic systemic approach to wellness, and he's been practicing now since 1993. He has master's and doctoral degrees in marriage and family therapy, and Dr. Jones uses methods of alternative healing, naturopathy, medicinal herbs, nutrition, sound waves, intellectual and cognitive self-regulation, naprathy, all of these to help remedy and manage mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual challenges. His telephone number, 731-7178. He's right here in Twin Falls. He's also now on Facebook, Eric F. Jones. That's Eric with a C. Eric F. Jones, Ph.D., mental health and wellness therapist. Telephone number to reach our program today, 736-0300. 736-0300. Let me just throw one last thing in here because I do want to mention this today before the show ends. This discussion about Mike Crapo and how some of the folks out there are just infuriated with our Republican representation that we have statewide. And I used to live in New York, where we had to deal with people like Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton. I lived in Vermont, where I had to deal with Pat Leahy. I lived in Delaware, where I had to deal with Joe Biden, and I had to deal with Chris Coons and the likes of that. I used to work in Maryland, too, as well, where I had to deal with Barbara Mikulski. For all of the complaining we do about when we talk about the Pacific Trade Partnership, the fact that our senators were behind that. Well, why is that? Because we're one of the few states that would actually benefit from it because of the agricultural sales. Would most states? Probably not. But on the other hand, if you're Jim Risch and you're Mike Crapo, you've got to run for re-election every 6 years, and you've got to go out and justify to people why we don't have any jobs or why we do have jobs. At least you could cut these guys a little slack and understand why they take the positions that they happen to do. And instead of always beating up on our elected officials, why don't we sometimes go to them and try to be nice and say, hey, can we work with you on this idea? And we'll support you if you do. Maybe that would be a better approach, but no, it always comes down to let's get a club and hit them until they do what we want. You're up next at 9:27. You're on the air on KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. Bill, if the current president was a conservative, half the time they would call him President Sotero. The lefty media investigates Republican conservatives with a microscope while they conceal everything negative about Democrats. Obama's school and passport records are in the name of Barry Soetoro. He then labeled himself a Muslim when he changed his name. I wish the GOP would go back to Columbia and Harvard, where before nobody said anything bad about him, but now some of these professors have probably lost their 40-hour week jobs, and some of their family have lost their insurance, and their deductibles are through the roof. They should check. We should go back there and check to see if he used a foreign student loan, and talk with the people in Columbia to see what they really know about him.
Well, I thank you much for the telephone call. Same topic every day, but I think it's one that's got to be repeated. 928, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. We're at 63. What I was mentioning a few minutes ago about supporting maybe some Republicans, even if you don't always agree with them or you don't always understand why they're making these decisions. Look, I have either been following politics or reporting on politics or working sometimes even in politics now for 50 years. I mean, my first real political interest goes back to the 1968 presidential election. And, I was reading newspapers cover to cover when I was in the third grade. I'm telling you, I have always been a believer that we are going to be able to somehow push these people to a particular direction, and we're going to drag them kicking and screaming if necessary. But after half a century of thinking that, can I tell you that it's not working? And that perhaps because we those of us at least who are of a more conservative or libertarian stripe, we have just stood here and we have beat these people with cudgels and hit them and hit them and hit them and hit them. It's like having a mule on the farm. And if you want that mule to move, you keep going out and hitting it with a switch every day. Sooner or later, the mule doesn't want to even see you coming down the path, and the mule is going to be looking for a way to get out of there and not have anything to do with you. And sometimes I think that we tend to be harsher on the people who are closer to our own beliefs than we are on the liberals. And I've got to be honest with you. Maybe they'd respect us more if we were a little politer, and because our votes still count. Yeah, money plays a role in politics too. But it's on election day, it comes down to all of those individual total votes. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 9:30. I want to just pick up for a moment on where I just left off, because I see it as well in the talk radio industry. Number one, a lot of us think that our U.S. senators should not be backing that Pacific trade deal. All right, well, you realize, as I said, why they are, because agribusiness is the one area in this country that will at least profit from it handsomely. And since agribusiness is a dominant industry in Idaho, even though it might not be in Michigan or parts of Illinois or in Massachusetts, it's a big deal here. But on the other hand, if you look at the overall picture, the deal might not be a very good thing for the United States in total. Yet, your two U.S. senators are only getting votes in Idaho. They're not getting votes from other states. So if you want them to come around to your side, instead of, as I say, don't go beat them with a baseball bat, but if you can tell them in large numbers, because it's going to cost them if they vote against it. So if you can tell them in large numbers, we'll back you up. Don't worry about it. How often do you do that? Because I don't think you do. And I'm telling you this from my own experience as a radio talk show host. It's 9:35. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. El Chapo calls here about 3 times a week with his drive-by shootings. Then hangs up the telephone. And rarely do I ever hear anybody follow up saying, and I used to work at a radio station where I'd get liberals calling up and they would do the drive-by thing every hour, every half hour, every quarter hour, just blah, 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 blah. And my employer hears that and thinks that's the reaction to me on the air. But then I'd go out in public. I'd go to a meeting, a Tea Party gathering, or I'd go out to a local diner and I have all these people telling me, listen to you every day. I agree with you nearly 100%. How come you don't call the show? Well, I don't see any need to. You do fine enough on your own. Except my employer only heard the negative. And so my employer's judgment was, well, he's antagonizing the entire public here. But I was getting different feedback because people were coming up and telling me this on the street, but I wasn't getting it on the air. And yet you treat your political leadership, mostly in the same party, the same way. They don't know you're there. And you're not there sometimes at critical moments for them. And I just find that I've been dealing with this throughout the primary season, and we're dealing with it now as we head toward the general election. What more do you want? Most of you never go to a public meeting. I sit here and talk every couple of weeks with somebody from City Hall. And they sit here and they, unless there's a big story that blows up like it did a couple of months ago. But for the most part, they could do these meetings. They can't technically do them in private, but they may as well because you're never there. And you could argue, well, I can watch the meeting online. I don't think most people do that. I mean, come on. We have so many other options in our life and too many other distractions that doesn't happen. So, my dad, for a time when he was working in a factory, they used to make battery chargers for Sears. Well, he'd worked in a couple of auto plants before that, and so he had some experience in industry, heavy industry across the board. But he ended up being the local, I guess they called him the district director for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And they would go off. He and a handful of guys were really leading the union movement, and they'd go off into negotiations, and then they'd go back out on the plant the next day, and everyone would say, "What'd you get for us?" And my dad would sit down and try to explain, "Well, we wanted more." And my dad would say, "Well, how come you didn't come along with us?" It was like, "Well, we elected you to do it, now go do it." Well, we didn't know exactly what you wanted because you weren't there. And I'm telling you, it goes across the board that way. So you've got a lot of people that we've elected to government, and they might be willing to break the mold if they knew we were behind them. But how can they know that they're behind you when every time they look at your Facebook page or social media, you're calling them a scoundrel or a cad or a scalawag? Does it occur to you maybe that perhaps that we could support them just a wee bit? Remember when they had the vote on concealed carry? Maxine Bell was not among those who voted to drop the permit requirement. But she told me, she said, in the whole debate, she had just 2 reactions from people in the public, and both were in support of her. And then everyone said, "Well, did you see what she did?" Well, how come you didn't talk to her before the vote, for crying out loud? You're next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on KLIX.
I agree with you for the most part. Everybody should have their representatives' numbers in speed dial, if you can call it that anymore. That's old school. Anyway, so my point is you kind of are contradicting yourself. I'm hearing an echo in my phone, and I don't have my radio on.
We'll get to the contradiction.
Okay, well, the contradiction is that you're so against us talking about the Pacific trade deal, but yet the illegal immigration is exactly the same deal, and they all go for it all the time because they get cheap labor.
Okay, how do we stop them from doing that?
Do what you're saying. You put their number in speed dial and light up the phones.
Right, let them know, because they have to have that feedback.
But they have to know the negative and the positive both. So that's why I agree with you, but you seem to be kind of giving them a pass on the illegal immigration or the Pacific trade deal, but not the illegal immigration deal.
Hadn't come up yet. Thank you much for the call. 20 minutes away from 10 o'clock. Bill Colley with you. Look, I went to one of these meetings held by a state legislator he lost a primary, and he was talking about why we shouldn't have refugees. But then he blurted out in the meeting that he hires illegal immigrants on his farm. Talk more about that coming up in just a few minutes. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. I got to confess that even if you heard the last segment of the program, I mean, if you were listening to it, even if you were hard of hearing, you probably heard it. But we do want to remind folks that, obviously, if you're listening to the radio, hearing is your most critical sense. And we've been sharing with you for over a year now stories about Dr. Christine Pickup, a doctor of audiology, Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert, the only locally owned independent hearing healthcare practice in southern Idaho. With advances in healthcare, she reminds you people are living longer and healthier lives, but cognitive decline continues to be a major concern. People with hearing loss have a much greater risk of developing cognitive decline, which can lead to dementia. The greater the loss, the greater the risk. Keeping your hearing healthy is an important part of your overall wellness. Knowing your hearing status and doing something about it can lead to a better, healthier life as you age. And now is the time. To schedule a hearing evaluation, you can call Mount Harrison Audiology for an appointment. The number 208-312-0957. Last summer, I got invited to help moderate an event about the refugee resettlement program. And as you know, I think that now is not the time to get too heavily into this program because, as I say, we all have our security concerns, our safety concerns. I also don't believe that when you get to a certain point, a tipping point, that certain cultures will ever mesh, and we seem to be looking at that. I went to this event, and I was asked to help moderate it, and the guest speaker was State Legislator Pete Nilsson, who lost a primary in May, so he will not be returning to state government. Now, he is a hero to many people, especially in the more libertarian side of the Republican Party in Idaho. And he and many of his colleagues, if you may recall, there was a discussion in Boise a couple of years ago that the government here in Idaho needed to make a strong statement that we would never have Sharia law. Now, I'm opposed to Sharia law in this country, and I think most of us are. But on the other hand, you only have so many weeks of legislating every year. And there's a lot of material that we don't get to that we should be getting to. Since no one right now is clamoring for creation of Sharia law in Idaho, why did we have that debate at the time when we perhaps could have been talking about how best to repair potholes, bridges, and the like, which was also important? And they got off into the weeds. I firmly believe that. They got off into the weeds on that, and they allowed media to portray them in a bad light. Sometimes, if you're a Republican, media is going to treat you that way anyway, but sometimes you give them all the ammunition you need, or they need in this situation. And since we did not have people at the time demanding Sharia courts in Idaho, it probably wasn't crucial that we have a statement made against Sharia at the time, back in 2015. Now, it may come to that, and we better be ready. I'm not saying, people out there, well, they have selective hearing while they're listening to the program. Oh, well, he said this. Well, he also said that, too. He's opposed to it, and we better make darn sure it never happens here. But it wasn't the most critical issue on the board in 2015. So I get to introduce the man, and I had a chance to chat with him for about 10 minutes before the program, and he seemed very nice, and he's a hardworking farmer, and I give him credit for all of that. But as he was speaking about the threat that this can pose eventually to our state, he got to talking about how he hires Latin workers on his farm because he feels that they're more reliable than the high school students that he used to hire who grew up in the area. And I'm sitting there in my chair and I'm thinking, I'm looking around this room and all of the people who are fawning after this man. I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. He just said he's potentially hiring illegal aliens to work on his farm. And the rest of you are like, well, that's okay as long as he's with us on Sharia law. No, it's not. And that's the thing I don't understand about a lot of people out there. And I'll put it this way, on the political fringe. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but you're choosing to be out in the cold on your own, out there in the sagebrush. And I'm telling you, you're not helping the situation out at this point. And I completely was floored by that night as I was sitting there listening to that and thinking, well, wait a minute. You want to talk about a contradiction? 948, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And so we don't seem to be able to play well with our own. And as I say, for 50 years, I have been a political basher. And I'm starting to look around and say, well, you know what? We haven't changed anything. In fact, things have only gotten worse. So maybe I need a new approach. I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but maybe I need a new approach. And maybe we all need to consider that and how we can better work with the people that we have in government. And as I said, we've got to be aware of what our own, what we're bringing to it ourselves. And that's an important part of it as well. The other part, too, is this. There was another election in the primary election, same district, but there's 2 seats. And Rich Wills, who had been a longtime representative as well, he was also defeated in that same district. But he had an entirely different worldview than Pete Nilsson had, yet they both lost. And the Republican establishment is infuriated because he lost his seat. But here's the thing. His primary opponent, Christy Zitto, she did not run a dirty campaign. In fact, of all of the insurgents, if you'll use that word, and not in a bad way, but all the people, they call it a pejorative if it's a bad word. But of all the candidates who were running insurgent candidacies in the primaries this year, she was probably the nicest. And she told me, she said, we go to the same church together, talk all the time. And so, but Republicans, the establishment is infuriated that she took his seat because she is a Republican. The Democrats will have token opposition, so she's going to be serving in the state legislature next year. And some current sitting legislators in her own party are refusing to talk to her. I know this not from her, but I know it from what legislators are telling me. Well, wait a moment here. She won by double digits. She didn't run a dirty campaign. Hello? The will of the people has spoken. It's like all of this talk about taking the nomination away from Donald Trump at the Republican convention. He won more votes than all of the other Republicans who were running. Not just more votes, he won an astoundingly large number of votes compared to all of the other Republicans running. How can you talk about taking this away from him? I was listening to a fellow this morning who was one of the delegates at the Republican convention. He was talking in a closed-door meeting. And you want to talk about a guy who still doesn't get it. This is a fellow, he is from the U.S. Virgin Islands. And he had an opportunity. His name is Redfield. Last name is Redfield. Take a listen for a moment.
As a politician, when I was running as a Republican in the Virgin Islands, I had to stay away from my party because I couldn't get elected. I had to get votes on all sides. A good politician is pragmatic. They have to be to succeed. Otherwise, you get this energy in the nation right now that is angry, frustrated, and they want to hit anybody. So we have certain candidates that are sucking that up and changing our label. As a party, we owe it to ourselves to speak out and not have the tail wag the dog, and not have somebody say all of a sudden, if you don't play my game, then I'm running as an independent, or I'm doing this. I'll see and I'll judge you. Good God, many of you have been in this room for year after year after year, working in the trenches, and all of a sudden somebody is going to tell you, any one of them, this is our party. It's the people's party, not the candidates. I've had it. Thank you.
No, this is our party, the People's Party, not the candidates. Well, again, Donald Trump got more votes probably than anybody else in the history of Republican primaries. Look, dude, you guys have lost. He keeps saying, our label. Well, what is your label? It's about me. No, it's about the people. That's why you have primaries. You want that input, or so you claim. You didn't get what you wanted. Now you want to take it away and reset the rules. I'm sorry, but, that does not look good. What do they call it in Washington? The optics? Then he says, when I was running for office, I had to get votes on both sides. In other words, I compromised my principles all the time. You want to talk about a scoundrel in politics, that's the guy. But, this is our party, the People's Party. Well, the people spoke, and you lost. Rich Wills lost in a primary by double digits. And you know what? That's because people decided in his district they wanted to change. About 25 years ago, I was reading a George Will column, and George Will said in his column, too many people in public office think it's their private property. And again, the seat is not yours. You are occupying it for the time until the public then makes a decision. Well, either one, you retire on your own, or the public decides it's time for you to retire. It is not yours. So when somebody defeats your buddy in a primary, that's because the people there wanted that change. And as far as Rich goes, he was supposed to come in here on the program one day at 9 o'clock. I scheduled it all in writing with him at 9 o'clock on an email. And he shows up at 8 expecting to get on the air. Well, I don't put anybody on the air generally at 8:06 because you have to have, in a consultant world, you have to have your setup for the program. And then I had to go drag him out of his car while he was outside steaming to get him inside the studio to be on the program. And if that's how he was running for office in his own district, I can see why he lost. But you know what? Again, it's not his private property. And if he got defeated fair and square, you got to respect that. 9:54, you're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. Well, the whole problem is that there's so many neocons and people that don't believe in the Constitution. And so when you have a constitutional candidate running, all of a sudden everybody says, oh, we can't have that, because we can't get back to that Constitution, which would really be the solution to our national problems, and abide by it. And they all take an oath to uphold it, and yet they just throw it in the corner and do whatever they want to.
Well,
and
here's my thought on all of this, too. You've got a lot of people who are constitutionalists in Idaho who've thrown in their lot with Donald Trump, who is the least of all the candidates running as a Republican, has the least respect for the Constitution. So we've already compromised ourselves.
Well, and so unfortunately, that's true. I mean, Trump is not a true constitutionalist, but then you look at the alternative. You got Hillary, who's just flat evil and running the Clinton mafia. So I mean, you just have we really don't have a lot of choice. We've been put in a corner, but unfortunately, the New World Order crowd, of course, Bill wants to destroy this country and create one world government.
And a dangerous thing, and I will admit Trump is at least opposed to that. Thank you much for the call, sir. 9:56, last caller of the morning, likely. You're on the air.
Good morning, Bill. You were talking about the guy compromising his principles. That's what it looks like to me with Maxine Bell. When she took an oath to uphold the Constitution, yet she votes against the constitutional carry.
Well, again, she was waiting for a reaction from the public. She got 2 reactions, and they both backed up her position.
More?
What's that?
Doesn't her oath matter regardless whether she gets any reaction from the public or not?
Representative. That's the title in her name, Representative Bell. But again, did you call her?
No.
Did you call her and remind her about that before the vote?
No, I didn't. You see, I expected her to uphold her oath.
Well, sometimes you got to remind people in advance. I thank you much for the telephone call. I thought she was fairly straightforward about it. She got 2 reactions. If this was such a big issue for so many people, where were you? She got 2. Again, that's 2. How many people? She represents tens of thousands. Where were all of you? So she went along with the 100% reaction she got, which was from 2 people, and said, all right, this is the way I'm going to vote. Because she got no other reaction. We all make our own compromises. The other day, I put a Mike Simpson bumper sticker on my car. Of course, I wanted to cover up an ugly bumper sticker that I couldn't remove, so it was brand new, and I figured I'll do that. But even though Mike Simpson only has a 48% rating from the American Conservative Union, from what I know of his opponent, things could only get worse. It's like a previous caller said about Donald Trump. The alternative is Hillary Clinton. So we all are making compromises, folks. And to sit here and say, well, I won't vote for so-and-so because they voted one time in 1996 for an issue I didn't like. Well, I'll tell you what, the only candidate I've ever agreed with 100% is myself. And I'm not running. I also know that Jesus Christ isn't running. There's no perfect candidate out there. So we all have to make those decisions. And I am just sick to death of hearing people criticize mine. And frankly, I got to be honest with you. I got to rethink sometimes when I'm criticizing decisions made by other people. I got to think about my own criticisms. Rush Limbaugh is up next, following the news at 10 o'clock from Fox. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. God willing, if the creek don't rise, they'll allow me to come back and do this all over again tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock.